Welcome to my suffering. I like to think I'm a pretty decent Souls player, but this DLC humbled me hard. I spent 64 hours completing this challenge, and while it was very hard, I found it pretty rewarding. I really like the challenge I get from these games, so it was quite fun for me. The rules for the challenge were as follows. I must stay at level 1 and never level up, and I cannot upgrade my Scadu Blessings. So I die in one hit and deal very little damage. I did use Cheat Engine a few times to get me some items and weapons I wanted, but if that irks you, I didn't really care, it just made my life easier. The main weapons I used for this run were Starfist, Poisonous Fang, and Ansper Rapier, with a few other celebrity appearances, but I'll cover those when I get to it. And this video was filmed about 2 months ago, right before the Radon nerf, so that really made me feel nice and warm inside because I beat him, then like a week later they nerfed him to the ground. And stay tuned to the end of the video for a DLC boss tier list, and any feedback is much appreciated. First boss up on the hit list is Divine Beast Dancing Lion, and for the build I used Poison Infused Ansper Rapier to proc Poison and Rot for some good damage over time, Blood Infused Starfist to get staggers and bleed procs, and then a Fire Misericord to get some juicy riposte damage, along with throwing daggers on my hotbar just to keep up that posture damage. This is a very proto version of my main build I end up using for most of the run. This was still my first boss, so I was still kind of figuring it out. Phase 1 is great. There's a lot of attacks where once you know the boss's moveset, you can weave in attacks in between the combos, and that goes for the whole fight, but you learn it in Phase 1, and it's really rewarding to learn. There are a few pesky camera issues since the boss is so mobile, but in all honesty, that's a skill issue. Just get better at spacing. The strat I came up for this fight is incredibly dumb and resulted in a lot of unnecessary deaths, but it was really fun to use, so I don't really care. I used the physics here that increases stance damage, and whenever phase 2 started, I just bum rushed him and tried to get a posture break as soon as possible. Phase 2 introduces 3 new modes he can get. He has Lightning, Frost, and a Wind phase, and Lightning's the one you'll see most since it's always first, and it's incredibly annoying. He has these lightning AoE effects that summon after he does certain attacks, and it just makes them fight super frantic because you can't really see him, and sometimes he'll get pushed into the actual lightning. Frost and Wind aren't as bad. Most of the time you just have to jump or outspace the attack, so it's not as bad as Lightning phase. The strat I went with was pretty dumb, just banking on getting staggers and getting bleeds. It worked out for me, but it caused a lot of unnecessary deaths, but it was fun. I liked it. That was the first boss down. Next boss up is Rolana, pretty much the same strat I used last time with a Ansper Rapier with Poison to get Poison and Rot procced. This time I have Cold Infused Starfist to get some frost damage, and then I have a Lightning Infused Misericord because she's very weak to lightning, and she's in water, so you get an extra damage buff from that as well. Rolana is very frantic, and she has some of the longest combos in the DLC. She has a lot of very quick flurry attacks and a lot of roll catching attacks. So the positioning in this fight is super important. And there is one really quick attack she can do, pretty much out of neutral, that changes the whole flow of the fight. It's her quick upslash with her left sword, as she is doing now, and this leads into almost her entire kit. All of her combos basically start out of this single attack. It is very quick to do, so if you are too late on a punish after dodging, there's a high percentage chance that she will catch you with this attack. A good way to tell if she's done with her combo strings is if she finishes the combo with both swords. Most of the time that results in a clear punish window, and there are specific times when she kind of has a delayed attack with a single sword that you can tell, this is my turn, now is my time to attack. Another tip is this boss can be scripted very easily. She has specific percentage thresholds that once she gets past them, she'll do certain attacks, like her phase transition or the giant magic sword swing that she does, plus the magic balls in phase 2. So once you get used to this fight, you can kind of plan around this. Like now in the phase change, I know if I can get 4 charged R2s off, I get a stagger, and with that I can get big damage. And phase 2 is much of the same as phase 1, except this time there's either magic effects or fire effects after the attack. Doesn't really add too much, it just makes dodging back worse, so most of the time you still want to dodge through, or just if you're far enough to keep dodging back. Overall, this is one of my favorite fights in the DLC. She requires a lot out of you, and she's very quick and very agile. And you don't know how many times. I got her this low at least 4 or 5 times, and I died every single time because I got greedy, thinking, oh, I just need one more hit for a stagger or one more hit till a bleed proc, and I got caught so many times being greedy, but this fight was amazing. I loved it. The fight took me about 3.5 hours of attempts as well. After taking down 2 remembrance bosses, I decided to take it a little easy, and I went after Golden Hippo. The fight is pretty easy, and I know it's skippable, but I'm including it just because I wanted to do it, and I wanted to showcase my favorite weapons in the game, which are the curved swords. and just use a 2 curve sword power stance jumping L1 combo, and he has 80 poise, and so luckily if you have enough damage, you can get a stagger right at the start of phase 2, and at that point you're just going to kill him because you just have so much damage from your consecutive attack bonuses, and that's what I went for in this fight. Then to open up the maps more and get access to Jagged Peak, I went for Ancient Dragon Man. He actually was kind of saucing me, not gonna lie. I hate NPC fights, and he was messing me up. I am using the Bloodhound's Fang just because I think it's best for NPC fights, and because it has enough stagger to just kind of interrupt their attacks. And it's a little bit faster than Great Katanas, so I used that. It was boring. It's pretty much just bait out the same attack and then R1, or go for the L2 combo if you want to swag on him. Next up on the Remembrance boss hit list is Putrescent Knight. And for the build, I used Holy Infused Starfist with a Holy Infused Misericord, just because he's really weak to holy damage, so I think it's the best route for this boss. For a while, I was trying to use the Ansper Rapier to get poison and rot procced, but I just think it wasn't worth it, and he's weak enough that you can just go straight for damage and not have to worry about the damage over time from that. Putrescent Knight is one of the easiest DLC bosses, mainly because he has a fairly low health pool and his moveset isn't as crazy or as aggressive as the other bosses. He is very agile with his horse because he moves around a lot in the arena, but that's not much of a problem since he normally closes the gap pretty quickly. Once again, I'm risking it for the biscuit and we get a stagger. I didn't even know you could stagger him out of his phase transition, but you can. The trickiest part about this boss for me is that he has 2 moves that are very similar. His horse can rear up and either roar or stomp on you, and they look very similar up close. Here's the stomp, and he'll do the roar eventually, and the roar is just harder to dodge because it just delays your timing a little bit. Honestly, PK is one of the easier bosses in the DLC. He only took me about 2 hours of attempts, and the last 20 was when I was just going straight into holy damage, so it makes for an easy boss. For the next DLC boss, I went for Scadu Avatar, and for the build, I used a Flame Art Clean Wrought Night Sword with a Flame Spear Ash of War to get some extra fire damage procced on it. Since, obviously, it's a tree, it's going to be weak to fire. Scadu Avatar is one of the more interesting bosses in my opinion in the DLC. It's the most unique since it's a big mix-up on the tree bosses we normally get in the base game, plus it has the whole 3 health bar thing, which at first is pretty cool, but on repeat fights, it just drags on for forever. On a regular playthrough, Scadu Avatar is honestly really easy, but at level 1 he's actually quite tricky, since most of the time you're using status effects to get extra damage, or percentage damage bonuses, but since he has 3 health bars, it just isn't as effective, so I think it's just best to go straight for fire damage since he is so weak. And obviously, the head is the weak spot, and he graciously sets it down every so often to get some big damage in. There's not much difference between his 3 phases in terms of his overall moveset. He does gain some very specific attacks he uses, like at the start of phase 2 and 3. Like right now he's doing is kind of just running around the arena, and I normally try to position him closest to the wall, so if he does his magic spell follow-up, sometimes the magic spells will get stuck inside of the wall, and that's just because I really had a hard time dodging those consistently, and that's just to kind of get more consistent on my end. And you continue to fight him the same way you do in phase 1. Just stay far enough away to try to bait out the certain head attacks that leave his head wide open for attacks and just get big damage on it, because the damage really is just only worth it if you're going for the head, and that's why I opted to use a rapier to get a little bit better range. And then in between these phases, I always try to reapply my buffs, get the fire buff, get Flame Grimmy Strength, and get Golden Val. Starting phase 3, it is the most scripted phase. He always does the same opening, and after a while he'll do a giant nuke AoE. I don't know how I dodged it this time around. I just got lucky and I was just spam rolling, but that's normally when you can just end the fight because he's going to stay still for so long and you can just wail on his head. I think Scadu Avatar is an interesting boss design-wise, but fighting him really isn't that fun. He has the same core moveset throughout all 3 phases, and he doesn't really add much to the fight, just adds new kind of AoE spells in later phases. And there are much more complex fights later on in the DLC that just make this one kind of look easy by comparison. Definitely not to say that he's easy by any means. I definitely struggled with him a bit more than I thought I would, since I really had to learn the whole moveset, because the first time I just steamrolled through him. But this fight took me about 3 hours of total attempts. Next up on the boss gauntlet is Commander Gaius. For the build this time, I was using Venomous Fang with Rot Grease, and then a Frost Infused Starfist, along with a Holy Infused Misericord. And also using Bloodhound's Fang just to get a little bit more consistent on this dodge, because this is the worst part of the fight for me. I hate this dodge so much, and it's just really tight to dodge for no reason. There's not a huge difference in overall poison and rot damage using this setup. I just liked it because it procs it a little bit quicker since you are normally getting 2 hits in instead of 1. However, the range is shorter, but I'm already using fist weapons, so it's just kind of something I got used to. Honestly, I came around to liking Gaius quite a bit. I do think the charge is still stupid, but the rest of his kit is really fun. Like, this jump attack is so sick, and the rest of his kit has these really fun moves to dodge, like baiting out back kicks and then just sidestepping them to get damage in. The only other negative I can think of is the fact that he runs away a lot since he's a mounted enemy, but it's normally not that bad, and the worst part is if he just does the charge again, like he does just there. Outside of those two reasons, I think the boss is actually incredibly well made. There's a good mix of range attacks and short attacks, and they're all just really fun to dodge. There's a lot of good mix-ups, a lot of clear visual tell, and I think this is honestly could have been one of the best fights in the DLC if they removed that charge. Gaius weirdly only has 100 poise, so after about 3 charge attacks and just 1 random hit, you can normally get a stance break, so that makes this for this fight to be very quick and very concise. And also, this long combo string he has, I think is incredibly fun to dodge, and once you learn the correct positioning, it just becomes... Phase 2 sees a few new moves added with some extra gravity magic, and the only one I really don't like is that one where he summons an orb that constantly like sucks in. It's kind of just annoying, and it's just kind of like crowd control, so just run away from it, but I do think it's funny that he just jumps up and starts spinning crazy and just rams back into the ground. I love Gaius, he's so silly. My main tips for this fight is pretty much just hug his lance side, and as much as you can, try to bait out those kicks, because those are really easy damage opportunities if you position it right, and you have a lot of ways to just get extra damage in by positioning with this fight, and I think that's one of the better aspects of the fight, is how it allows for skill expression in that way. And that's one of the main reasons I love doing these RL1 runs, is learning these bosses' movesets to a degree where you get to master them and try to find every available opening just to make the fight even viable. And I know while some people don't enjoy it, I really like that aspect of these games where you can get to a point where you can do most of these fights hitless. And the high you get after beating a boss is like 15 times more at RL1, because you're always winning from death, you're always on death's door, and it makes for some incredibly rewarding moments. Gaius was fairly easy, it only took me about an hour and a half to beat, but I still really enjoyed the fight. Jory sucks. This fight is stupid, I hate it. I tried fighting it straight up for a while, for 3 hours, and the worst part is this freaking dungeon. You have to redo it every time if you want to change your build up a little bit. It sucks. Just backstab chain him. It's so much easier, it's so much simpler, and it is so rewarding to just stomp on this stupid boss. I hate this boss so much. 3 hours of attempts. 3 hours. It's so annoying, I hate him. And now we're going to bounce back from one of the worst bosses to one of the best bosses in the DLC, with Midra, Lord of the Frenzied Flame. This time for my build, I decided not to use Poison and Rot, mostly because Midra is very close up and never really runs away that often, and he has pretty high resistances, so I thought it was just better just go straight for Frost and Bleed, with a Frost-infused Starfist and a Blood-infused Misericord. Midra's main weakness is only having 80 poise, meaning you really only need 3 charged R2s to get a stagger off, and it makes this fight incredibly quick and incredibly fun and high octane. Midra is very fun to fight. He has a lot of quick moves and a lot of moves that you can weave attacks in between them, and it just makes this fight flow like butter. Midra has one of the best movesets in the DLC in my opinion, and while most of his moveset is mainly just sword swings, it's all in the timing and how he does it. There's so many reaction based or like slight little delays that you have to master every single one, and while he's not super hard and challenging, I do think he's incredibly fun to fight. Midra also has quite a lot of range attacks, and there's one that he can do sometimes after this phase transition with like a hyper beam laser right at you, so I normally just run right back in at the start of phase 2 because it just makes him less likely to do that attack. Phase 2 adds some good visual flair to the fight, along with some like fire after effects and some new attacks. It really doesn't change too much of the fight. It honestly just makes it more of a spectacle, and I'm all for it. I love this fight. I think it's one of the best build-ups to a boss in the DLC. Also, the presentation in the actual fight is amazing. The boss arena is amazing. Every aspect of this boss fight, to me, is just top-notch. His moveset really isn't that wide and varied, but he mixes his sword swings up enough to make it feel nice, and there's a lot of interesting attacks he can do that change up depending on your positioning, so I think he's a very, very well-made boss. He also has the most HP of any boss in the DLC, so it can make his fight feel quite long, but I'm okay with it. I love this fight. I think it's great. I think it's fantastically made, if you couldn't tell already. And I think Midra is the king of the presentation in the DLC, in terms of the amount of build-up you have towards this boss fight. Exploring Midra's romance, going through the whole Abyssal Woods section to find the Lord of the Frenzied Flame, and every time you're exploring you can hear him scream, see him sporadically, and just learning more lore. This boss is amazing, and it shows how good this DLC is, and I think this is honestly the best DLC FromSoft has ever made. Midra was on the lower end in terms of hours of attempts. He only took me 2 hours, but I think he's pretty fun to fight, and he's also pretty easy, and I have a pretty good read on his moveset to begin with. So he does fall towards the lower end of boss difficulty hours-wise, but he's still one of my favorites. I love you, Midra. The next Remembrance boss I went after was Matir, Mother of Fingers, and for the build I used, once again, a same kind of build as Gaius. I used Venomous Fang with Rot Grease to get Poison and Rot, but this time I used Blood Infused, Starfist, and Misericord since she has a lot lower bleed resistance than frost resistance. Matir is kind of a weird boss because on her own she's not that difficult. Her moveset's fairly simple with a lot of hand slams and head bashes and just kind of sprawling around randomly. But then she has some really stupid moves like when she summons Finger Creepers, or like in phase 2 she can do like a hollow purple attack, which literally the only way to dodge is by just having Raptor of the Mist, Ash of War, or playing super passive and always staying as far away as possible, which in my opinion is a complete miss on game design. I like to think it was intended to use Raptor of the Mist, but it's just really annoying. Phase 1 outside of some of the more iffy moves is actually pretty fun. I do find the camera is pretty good in this fight, and I do like that she has a weak spot on her belly so you can get extra damage. And most of the fight can either be solved by rolling back or like scooting back and then rolling into her, because sometimes she'll have a lingering hitbox. And here's a cool tech you can use to get extra R2 hits, is if you tap R1 while facing the boss kind of in that general front area, it'll automatically lock on and get you a stagger. So it's really good to get extra hits just for bleed. And this attack coming up can be dodged by rolling, but I just could never get the timing down, so since I already had Raptor of the Mist, I was just going to use it. Phase 2 doesn't necessarily add too many moves. There's a few kind of long-range moves she does, like this one where she summons a bunch of orbs, and it's basically just to get away. And then she gets up in the spinning attack, and honestly, I have no idea how to dodge this up close. I was only able to consistently dodge it far away, and it is another kind of weirdly designed move because it just has such a lingering hitbox. And if you're too close, sometimes you just get hit by it, and I can't seem to fully dodge it. But this fight can feel a little more RNG based, since if you're too close and she has a spinning attack, you're just gonna die, and if you're too far away, she'll sometimes summon the Finger Creepers. Luckily in this fight, I got really good RNG and got a stagger, and I never actually got the hollow purple type attack in this fight, and right here I was running away because I was scared of it, but she summons creepers, and at this point, I'm just trying to play passive to let the rot do a lot of work and make her come to me. Pause. Unfortunately, this fight could be really good, but I feel like the iffy moves and some of the undodgeable type attacks just really irk me. I think it brings down the quality of the boss, because without it, I think it's an actually really good boss, and I quite enjoy it. Overall, I spent about 2.5 hours fighting Matir. I think this is a weird fight, because it could go way longer, but way shorter, depending on RNG, but it's a fairly well-rounded fight outside of some really iffy moves. Next up, we got Romina, Saint of the Bud, and for the build this time, I was using Frost Starfist with a Fire Infused Misericord. She's really weak to fire and has fairly low frost resistance, so I figured it was best to just kind of try to burst it out with the frost and then using the fire to reset the frost damage. That attack I just dodged is kind of a weird one of her harder moves to dodge. It seems like the first sweep of her tail doesn't have hitbox or delayed hitbox for some reason, so I found it's best to just kind of walk through the first one and then roll through the second and third. And Romina, like Midra, also has 80 poise, so it makes the fight pretty easy because you just need 3 charged R2s to get a stagger. And a lot of times when you get a stagger, you're going to get a frost proc, so that's why you use the fire from Misericord to reset the frost. Romina is a very middle of the pack type of boss. She has a very cool moveset and is very fun, but she feels out of place in the DLC with no cutscene or no kind of lore building up to her, and she just kind of randomly shows up, and for some reason she also has rot. But the boss's mechanics and moveset is very fun, and I do like this kind of take on a mounted boss with an appendage in the front and behind to kind of use for attacks. And she's fairly mobile enough so she doesn't run away. She's always fairly close to you. There's not much different between phases 1 and 2. She adds an extra like butterfly effect to some of her attacks, but it really doesn't make the boss that much more difficult. A lot of her moves are the same, and she's pretty much a pushover compared to the rest of the DLC bosses because of her low poise, and she can just get frosted very easily. Outside of the boss fight, Romina just kind of seems like a weird inclusion because all these other bosses have a good amount of lore behind them, but it seems like Romina has it the least, and I did hear a rumor that she was going to have a cutscene, but they cut it. I really would have liked to see that because I feel like there could be a lot of cool stuff they could have done with it, so I don't know if it was a time constraint, but I do think she's a very well-designed boss. She feels kind of weird, like they had this idea for a boss, and they just couldn't fit it in the base game, so they added it into the DLC. Ramana is by far the easiest remembrance boss in the DLC. She only took me about an hour of total attempts, and it just feels kind of unfinished. I really wish they would have added more moves to her second phase, or just added more to this fight to give it more value, but I still enjoy the fight a lot. And next up is the poster child of the DLC, and what some consider the best boss in the DLC, Mesmer the Impaler. For the build, we used Frost Starfist and a Bleed-infused Misericord. I didn't use any Rot or Poison, as the Poison and Rot resets when there's a phase cutscene transition, and since there's separate health bars and separate boss names, it doesn't carry over, so it's not worth it to try to apply Rot and Frost in both phases or one or the other. And Mesmer is very aggressive, so you don't really need the damage over time effects. I normally like to use those when the bosses run away a lot or there's a lot of downtime just to get extra damage built up, but Mesmer is always aggressive. And you're seeing here, once he gets below around 80%, he starts adding a few new moves to his moveset. That one is kind of his main air combo, and it's fairly simple to dodge. And Mesmer has a vast array of different combos, so it really mixes it up. There's some where you had slight delay in between, and there's some where you can get, like just there, you can get a tap R2 in before the next hit comes in, and luckily I got a stagger, but I was prepared for the roll. One thing I also love about this fight is how the two phases differ a lot. Phase 1, you can tell it's much more refined, it's much more practiced, but Phase 2 is much more carnal and just violent. Mesmer obviously does not care anymore. He is going all out, and he is using everything at his disposal to kill you. I think the snake summons as a whole are a great concept, and they make the fight very frantic and very fun. As a whole, I think the hitboxes are mostly pretty good. There are a few specific moves that have really questionable hitboxes. And another tip for Phase 2, pretty much after every main grounded combo he does, he'll end with a twirl towards you. So if you can get space and then roll back away from it and try to like land similarly to where he's at, you can get an extra charge R2 off. Mesmer as a fight is just a masterfully made boss. Everything that goes into it is just perfection. The build up, the overall fight, the change up between phases 1 and 2 is spectacular. And I think Mesmer rightfully deserves all the hype he gets. He is an incredibly made boss from one of the best DLCs FromSoft has made. Mesmer overall took me about 4 hours of attempts. He's pretty challenging, but I still loved every minute of it. From learning every combo he has to just learning the ins and outs of this fight was just pure perfection, and I love this boss with every fiber of my being. I didn't want to have too much fun, so I did the gank fight next. I did cheese it fairly hard. I used the Dragon Slayer Great Katana and just pretty much got distance and spammed the weapon art I summoned for it. I don't care. I'm not doing this solo. It was so stupid. I know some people did. I don't care if you do. I'm not doing it. I know you can pretty much just use Shield Crash and just cheese the whole fight, but I just went for this method. It's alright. I made sure to do the quest line stuff to get everyone possible on my side and limit the amount of enemies on Leda's side. So it's pretty much just Dane and Leda versus me and the gang. And while he's technically not a remembrance boss, you have to fight Bale. You have to. He is one of the best fights in this DLC, and in my opinion, the best dragon boss FromSoft has ever made. The build for Bale is full cheese mode. I used Frost Iron Balls for Phase 1 to get Frost procs and just try to get staggers. And then once he would go into Phase 2, I would pull out the Ansper Rapier I had and then proc it with Rot Grease. So that way I could just deal a bunch of Rot damage at the start of Phase 2 and try to get Rot going while he's doing all of his, giant, massive flying around attack. And one of the best tips for Bale is whenever you get a stagger, don't take the riposte right away. If you do a running R1 or anything that's not just a regular R1, you can just wail on them, and it's really good to get extra status build up, especially for bleed. Doing it with Frost isn't as necessary, as you don't really add to the next Frost proc, but it's just more free damage, and it's really good for bleed because you get extra status build up on every hit, and it can just lead to really good damage you can get on him. And Bale can be very tricky to get staggers on. He has the full 120 poise of most TLC bosses, and there's a lot of really tricky attacks where you have to know the right positioning to be in the right spot to get a charged R2 off on his head, because his head does move a lot. Sometimes if you're too close, you'll whiff and you'll kind of miss, or if you're too close, he can move his head around and kind of mess with the camera. But here, normally, I would pull my Ansper Rapier and apply Rot to get Rot started at the start of the phase, but I thought I was close to a Frost or a Stagger, so I kind of risked it. It really doesn't work because in Phase 2 he's very, very mobile, so it's really hard to actually get a full stagger. See here, he's just jumping around, he's flying around, he's wasting my time, so it's very tricky in Phase 2 especially to get staggers and status. In Phase 2, Bale adds a lot of these very spectacle moves and a lot of these longer move combos, so That's why it's really important to try to get rot proc as soon as possible, and on this winning attempt, I was kind of being stupid. But eventually, after getting a frost and finally deciding to actually proc rot, it does a lot of damage over time. It is just incredible for these fights because they are so aggressive that sometimes you just can't attack for a while. So it's really good to keep that damage up over time, and that's really important for these last two fights with Bale and Radahn, as they are very, very challenging fights. So I recommend using as many statuses and as much damage as you can muster to fight these bosses. And now finally, after running away for a while, I finally came to my senses and tried to apply rot. I was a little stupid though, because I thought I could apply the rot grease at a time when I definitely couldn't. Like right now, this is not safe. I don't know why I did that, but that's kind of the luxury you get with the Opaline Bubble Tier, is you get one mistake. So it doesn't really save you from these fights because you still have to learn, the whole moveset. It just gives you one mistake and one mess up. And it's really nice, and I really like using it. I know some people don't want to use it for RL1 runs and they like to go true hit list, but I used it, I enjoyed it, it was great. I've barely talked about Bale's moveset, but it is amazing. Phase 1, I prefer a bit more just because he stays on the ground more and there's less of this, go up in the air, summon fireballs and come down at you, and less time wasted. But I still think both phases are incredibly fun to fight. On its own, Bale as a spectacle is just cinematic. It is incredible. It does kind of lag your PC sometimes, but after, they've done patches, and this was a while, this wasn't on release, so it was not nearly an issue as much as it was on the first release of the game. Bale has a very big moveset. He has a good amount of, close range and far away attacks. I think it's in your best interest to stay pretty close to him because some of his fire attacks have fire giant fire for some reason and bounce off the environment and can hit you from random angles, and it's really stupid, and I don't know why they always do it. Outside of the fire and some of his phase 2 antics with wasting time, this fight is incredible. Even with the phase 2 wasting time and all his, big spectacle moves, I think it adds to the fight so much. It makes you really feel like you're fighting this massive dragon lord, and he decided to go all out for one last time because he knows he's probably going to die if he does it. And using his, summon these wings and flying around, it's such a good fight. The fire, though, is less excusable. It's just really annoying, and the start of the fight is the worst because sometimes he'll just randomly use that attack and it just ruins some attempts. Bale, to me, is the epitome of the DLC. He has a really good phase 1, very grounded, very good, but then phase 2, they add a lot of flair to it, and there's some times in this DLC where I feel like they go a little too over the top, whether it be with difficulty or visuals. The visual clutter is now mostly sorted out, but I feel a little conflicted about it because this wasn't the FromSoft I fell in love with originally with Dark Souls 1, but I still see the artistry in it, and I still really enjoy these games, and I'm really excited for the future. Finally, Promised Consort Radahn. The whole run took me 64 hours. This boss alone was 25 hours start to finish. This is by far the hardest boss I've ever fought in anything ever. For 1 week, every time I had an hour to spare, I spent it making attempts. Radahn was the boulder and I was Sisyphus. Every time I got a good run going, I would die in phase 2 and the boulder would roll back down. From every cross slash that I was slightly out of position to dodge, to all the deaths from the holy effects in phase 2. Every death made me more resilient, and unlike Sisyphus, my torment had an end. By using every strategy available, besides parrying, because I'm not a coward, I would know victory. I went through many different build variations, and what I ended up winning with was using Poison Infused Venomous Fang, which if infused with poison gets the strongest version of poison in the game that deals about 15% of the boss's max HP versus the regular about 5% you get from regular poison. I paired that with Frost Infused Iron Balls and using R2 to try to get staggers and hopefully only one Frost proc, which is important for later on. And while he's very weak to Rot in phase 1, I tried to save it for phase 2 because Rot is so valuable in this fight, especially in phase 2 when he runs away and has so many long attack strings. It really helps get that extra damage over time. I enjoy phase 1 quite a lot. I think it's really fun, and there's a lot of varied sword combos he has, and the right amount of longer range stalling attacks. The worst part is obviously the frame trap cross slash they eventually patched, but pre-patch, it changes the whole dynamic of the fight because it forces you to fight in a very specific way on a very specific side of him. The cape he wears also limits visibility, but compared to phase 2, this is nothing. You can see clear as day compared to phase 2. Once I get him close to the phase 2 threshold, I want to be sure not to try to get a stagger or a critical attack off because that messes up your positioning at the start of phase 2, and for the strategy I'm going for, that is very important. This is what the strategy looks like when it works. At the start of phase 2, you throw a hefty rot pot, and then once he goes up for his holy attack, you throw a second one, stand still, use Raptor of the Mist to get through the holy attack. This is very RNG dependent though, and unfortunately, I did not get lucky. And so my winning attempt was very scuffed. The reason you want to use the hefty rot pots is because it does a staggering 30% max HP, which is vital for this fight, and I'm honestly amazed that I got this to work because I had so many attempts get so close when I even got the hefty rot pot off. For phase 2, I have the Ansper Rapier with the Chilling Mist Ash of War. This way, in case of bad RNG like in this attempt, we can get the regular version of Rot for some extra damage over time, and Chilling Mist is really good at getting quick frost procs, which is why we only want to try to get one in phase 1, so that way we can get easy frost in phase 2. And the dagger that I have Raptor the Mist Ash of War on, it's fire infused in case we want to try to reset the frost to get more damage, but I ended up in this attempt just switching right away to backhand blades just to stay more consistent and not have to worry and juggle so many things at once. I opted for using the backhand blades over the blood infused star fists, mainly because in all of my attempts I got maybe 4 staggers in phase 2. His poise just resets so quickly, it's just not worth it, and you get way more damage just going for backhand blades and just trying to get more bleeds. They also are much easier to get hits in with, and sometimes with the star fist you will whiff, but with these, that's not a problem. Another key part of the build, which you saw me use earlier in the fight, is the Uplifting Aromatic, which is essentially an Opaline bubble tier for 40 seconds, and it's really good just to get some extra, consistency off. I didn't use it very much, and this was like really towards the end of my fights when I started using it, but it helped immensely, and it is really good to use. Promised Console Radon pushes the limits of Elden Ring boss design, and at release, he was a much worse boss than he is now. There's been a few patches, a few moves have been tweaked and reworked, and they toned down the visual flair. I think FromSoft realized their mistakes and they tried to fix it. My original script was mostly just complaining about stuff that they fixed, so now it's kind of null and mute, but since they fixed it, I honestly think he's a fantastic boss that requires some of the most precise dodging, positioning, and knowing the correct attack windows. One aspect of the fight I wish they could have fixed is the terrain in the arena. I think it's absolutely horrible, because if you're fighting in this middle area here, there's a lot of different elevations, and that can lead to some cheap hits from the Holy After Effect. With every new Souls-like FromSoft makes, it seems that they tried to make it the hardest game yet, and I think they came close with this DLC of making bosses that are too difficult and they just are not good bosses. In my opinion, the pillar of FromSoft difficulty is that every time you take damage, it is your fault. Elden Ring in the DLC has a few moves that require very specific items, Ashes of War, or Physic Tears to avoid attacks completely. I think this is a very fine line that they are treading, but according to some interviews I've seen, it sounds like going forward, they're more focused on making some smaller games that explore different mechanics, so I think we're headed back in the right direction now. This attempt was probably the clutchest moment in my life. My girlfriend told me before I started the attempt that this was the last one before I went to bed, and I clutched up so hard. There are so many times in this last 30 seconds that I thought about just risking it and knowing I was close to a bleed proc, but luckily I played smart, I played safe, and we got the win. After 25 hours, I got the boulder over the hill. I am free of this self-imposed challenge, and I have beaten Shadow of the Erdtree at rune level 1 with 0 Scadu Blessings. And let's get that tier list started. We got all the bosses I fought in order of how I fought them, and then here's just the NA tier of bosses that were included in the tier list that I didn't fight. Divine Beast Dancing Lion is an easy A tier fight. I think he could be S tier, but the Lightning Phase holds him back, but he's a spectacular first boss. Rolana, another easy A tier fight. I put her above Divine Beast Dancing Lion. I just think she's more interesting, but doesn't have the oomph of an S tier boss. Ancient Dragon Man is just an NPC, but a little better, so it's D tier. Golden Hippo, slightly better. It's just a field boss with a cool arena, but it's good enough. Putrescent Knight, your boss, not the worst, not the best. Erdtree Avatar, another B tier boss, but I put him in front of Putrescent Knight. I think his moveset is very unique and very diverse, and I think that gives him the edge over Putrescent Knight. Gaius, the B tier boss. Fringe, A tier. If the charge was reworked, I think he could go in A tier, but as he is now, B tier. Jory sucks. We are on the Jory hate train. No one likes Jory. Midra, easy S tier, no questions asked. Matir, C tier. Not the worst boss in the DLC. Scratch that. The worst boss in the DLC, but not the worst boss in Elden Ring in general, but just not to the quality of the rest of the DLC. Ramana Saint of the Bud, another B tier boss. I think this is a very solid kind of mid-tier lineup of bosses, and they're all really good in their own right. Mesmer the Impaler, easy S tier. gonna put him at the number 1 slot for now, because he's everything you want a DLC boss to be. Bale the Dread, obviously an S tier, but where does he land? I'm putting him at 3 for me. I think he's really good. This is an insane top 3 bosses. But is it the true top 3? Now we have Radahn, Consort of Miquella, and I'm putting him in the S tier. I think he is a spectacular boss after the patch. Pre-patch, probably A tier, but since the patch, I'm putting him in S. Now, I'll leave you with some of the lowlights of all my Radahn attempts. There was 25 hours of footage to go through, but these are some of the jankiest moments and some of the worst deaths I had. Overall, this was a really fun run. I love learning these bosses to the point of being able to do them near hitless, but with Radahn, it definitely started to get a little tedious, but as an overall experience, I loved it, and I think if you're up for the challenge and have plenty of time and sanity remaining, it's well worth it. This was my first real attempt at a YouTube video, and it was a lot of fun, but it took a lot of work. And I don't know if I'm going to make any more. I have a few ideas floating around, but it kind of depends on the support I get. So leave a comment, subscribe, whatever. Do whatever you feel is necessary. And if it's good enough, I'll make some more videos. But that's all I got for now. And if you made it this far in the video, comment Ron Burgundy.